Uh, Hi, I'm Philip Goodwin with Rhetoric of Reno, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Nancy Welch of the University of Vermont in preparation for our Capitalism, Climate, and Public Discourse Symposium. Dr. Welch, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before going into the content of your work, I'd like to ask you broadly about your style. Much of your work employs a narrative as vehicle for making arguments. And since the social turn, if not before, much of the field recognizes narrative as a valid form of meaning making and as an effective rhetorical tool for activism. Yet our journals still privilege the kind of discourse of civic forums and discussion and debate that follow a rational discursive model. What goals do you hope to develop with this narrative form?
Um, well, for starters, I mean, I think, we always go out into the world equipped with a set of theories. We couldn't even begin our days without having, some theories about the kind of world we're going to go out into, the kinds of interactions we'll have with people, what's going to be expected of us, and so forth. And yet my concern is that our theories become untethered from that world of experience. Our theories come from that world of experience, whether it's direct experience or inherited, the kind of traditions and cultures that we're grown up within. But those theories also become untethered, abstracted from the world of experience, reified apart. And so my work as a teacher and a scholar is to try to always, first of all, reconnect our theories about the world that we live in with that kind of messy, contradictory, eventful, everyday world of experience, but with the understanding that that experience is social, and that's really the task of approaching narrative, is to understand that it's social and that it's the role of the reader and the writer to draw that out and grapple with it, so that our experience can be interrogated through our theories about the world, but also so that our theories about the world can be potentially disrupted, complicated, interrupted by that everyday world of experience. I guess that as I do this, I have a number of touchstones as a teacher and a scholar whom I rely on. And I'll just give a couple of examples here. In Living Room, early on, I talk about feminist sociologist Dorothy Smith, for whom narrative is also a starting point, not an end point of ethnography, but a starting point, so that we can always see how our cultural constructions, our social regulations and institutions and roles are enacted through bodies, through the bodies of people who are also worked up as raced, classed, gendered, and so forth. And so, that task of critical ethnography, to always look at and interrogate, how do these theories happen to us, and what do they mean? So that's one of my guides. But I think another guide would be Paulo Freire, because of the that affliction of narration sickness that he talks about in teaching, is also one that I think of in terms of how we go about writing and telling stories, and that is that listening is as important as telling stories, and to listen to and be tuned into the stories of others, and not to set oneself up as an omniscient narrator or the only expert storyteller who's out there. So that's another guide for me as well.
You say that this is, that narrative is invested in the social, and you bring up ethnography and Dorothy Swift. Do you think that narrative lends itself more to certain topics as an avenue into examining them, like social justice, for instance, or gender and identity and race and class?
Yeah. Well, I think as Dorothy, and it's Smith, Smith, as she emphasizes, the question is always, how does the world happen to us as it does? And so, if we want to understand the world as it is, then narrative is an avenue into that. But I also think if we want to begin imagining the world as it could be, that storytelling and tuning into the stories that are being told is very powerful. And here I think there's a wonderful little collection of essays that Leon Trotsky wrote in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, The Problems of Everyday Life. And they're a collection of essays where he's going around and kind of listening to the stories that people are telling about the questions that the revolution has thrown up. What will the family look like now? How should we go about matters like childcare? What does it mean that we still have a language that has formal markers of, class and privilege, and so forth? And and Trotsky's approach to this was not to try to decree answers. And he argued against the idea that any government ministry should say, here's how childcare should be delivered now, and here's what our language should be. Those are ideas that would come with Stalinism. But instead he was really interested in what people in their workplaces, in their villages, in their cities and neighborhoods, what kinds of answers and ideas they were devising, what kinds of stories they were telling about childcare arrangements, or how the Russian language was changing to dispense with those formal classed markers and so forth. So, so I think that that's a really powerful example of, kind of critical ethnography in a moment of profound change.
Do you think that you're saying that with this Trotsky, with this book, that it opened up certain questions, or made available certain kinds of questions about the family, about what society should look like now that this change has happened? Do you think that this narrative format opens up a lot of different avenues for rhetorical scholarship that are inhibited by sort of traditional forms of discourse?
Well, I think that, what it does is that it gives us a model of rhetoric from below. So instead of only looking to official sources and official voices for the answer, or for a set of answers that are abstracted from the kind of material, geographic, historical locations that they come from, again, it's recognizing that the problems of everyday life are things that everyday people are also, and can also, especially in moments of big social change, take up and find answers to. And I feel like we see examples of this all around, including how students on campuses, especially through the Black Lives Matter movement right now, are figuring out, like, how do we take back our universities? How do we work for the kind of world that we want? And so I think that learning as a rhetorician to pay attention to those voices and those moments, and see that that's where our ideas about rhetorical practice can come from, I think it's very exciting.
The impetus for Living Room teaching public writing in a privatized world was the swift privatization that happened following September 11th, 2001. It's something you situate within the logics of a neoliberal movement over the last 30 years, or a neoliberal project over the last 30 years. And you're right that following September 11th, you found yourself in a kind of activism school, and that had implications for your teaching and your sense of what it means to be in composition and rhetoric. Can you explain this experience and how it changed your teaching?
So I would say that before the fall of 2001, I didn't see myself as being in rhetoric at all. I thought of myself as a writer who teaches writing, who tries to work with students to discover what they can do, mostly as individuals, through writing. And rhetoric I thought of as as something, official discourse from official persons attached to official institutions, whether you're talking about presidential speeches or the IMF, and that you might study and critique that discourse, but unless you were super empowered with some kind of office, you didn't have much means to affect it. And I think it was especially in the fall 2001 that my sense of that really changed. I mean, I had been before, involved in clinic defense lines for outside abortion clinics for reproductive rights. I had, been a great admirer of my students who were involved in the global economic justice movement. But it was especially in that really polarized world of the fall of 2001 that I suddenly realized, and I don't know why I didn't realize this before, but that people coming together like September 11th, Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, who were trying to create a space, trying to make their voices and arguments heard, trying to counter that kind of nationalist, Islamic phobic, warmongering atmosphere that we were in. Suddenly I realized that's rhetoric. That's rhetoric from below rather than from above. And at that point, I knew that I really wanted to be involved with it, but that also it should really inform my teaching as well.
Okay. So you look at tactics from the margins, as you say, or rhetoric from below. And in Living Room, you write about looking at the labor movement of the early 20th century. I was wondering if you could explain how, by teaching those tactics or examining those tactics, how that informs your students' projects in the classes you write about.
Right. One thing I always want to make sure I do is that I'm never teaching tactics separate from the strategies and the visions of the groups that devised them. Like if you think about the wave of sit-down strikes from the 1930s, that tactic certainly had a tactical advantage, and that is that the workers realized that by staying in the factories and by occupying the factories, they'd solved the problem of bullets from police and militias. Every time they left the factory and went out on strike, they would get hammered. But if they stayed in the factory, the boss was reluctant to send the army in because it might hurt the machines. But the tactic is also bound up with a larger vision, and that is the vision of, first of all, of being able to assert we're more than our machines. As workers, we have agency, we have power, and we have abilities that are more than just extensions of the machines that we operate. And so so that the sit-down strike is a part of showing and advancing that vision. But the another piece of the vision is towards building a mass collective democratic society, including with democratic voice over production, conditions of work, how what work is being done, how the fruits of that labor will be distributed. And the sit-down strike as a tactic also advances that democratic vision, because the workers day to day operating the strike, first of all, they get to know each other across divisions of race and nationality and language and so forth. And then also just in learning how to run the strike together day to day, they learn what it might mean to be self-governing. And so whether I'm talking with my students about, any of the kind of what I think of as the kind of classic labor rhetorical arts, sit-down strikes, soapboxing, songs, cartooning, and so forth, I also want to make sure that we're not just looking at these as kind of tactics, but also what kind of movement and what kind of vision do they come from. But with the second part of the question about the kinds of projects that these inspire. First of all my students love the songs and the cartooning, and they always want to go there. But I can't, in a class at the end of the semester, say, okay, now go out and start a movement. That's your final project. The kinds of ideas my students have for what they can do with what we're learning depends on what's happening outside the classroom. So in living room, I'm teaching one, I was teaching one class in the spring of 2003. Students were coming into the classroom with their experiences from participating in Code Pink, Students Against War, Students for Palestine. And so they were drawing all kinds of agitational conclusions from what we were doing. But more recently, I taught a first-year seminar, Dangerous Women and Rebel Girls, about radical women redders in the progressive era. And it was politically a period of kind of quietude, and the campus was quite quiet. And so in that class, when I would ask students, how is this useful? What are you drawing from what we're doing? They were making definite connections between the Red Scare of 1919 and Islamophobia today. But the kinds of things they could imagine doing with those connections were not so much agitational, but more propagandistic or educational. Lots of debates and discussions in their dorms. One student wrote an op-ed for the campus newspaper. They brought their friends to a panel on the subject, but quite different from perhaps if I taught that course in another year. But I also really valued what they did, because I thought they showed good rhetorical sense about kind of the climate they were in, and what it was possible to do with their learning.
I'm going to move on to the book you're co-editing with Tony Scott, First Year Writing, and your chapter in it, First Year Writing and the Angels of Austerity. First Year Writing and the Angels of Austerity. And you turn your focus from the privatization of public lives to the privatization of public institutions of higher education. And you use what you call a social feminist framework as a means to argue that departments that cannot easily be brought to market are regulated to the supposedly domestic role of social reproduction. This socialist feminist lens also leads you to argue that in cultural logics of neoliberalism, first-year composition will always be constituted as domestic labor and unworthy of fair compensation and support. And you conclude that to fight such trends in the neoliberal university, we should work, quote, to create a mass socializing logic of solidarity across stratified departments and a campus workforce that can rival neoliberalism's ruling logic. Can you describe why this framework is effective for cultivating solidarity across campus? This seems, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I guess that one thing I would want to stress is that social reproduction isn't limited to domestic labor in the domestic sphere. So it involves tending to the bodies and provisioning a current and future generation of workers. It also involves equipping a current and future generation of workers with an education, with a set of ideas, skills, outlooks, habits, and including a set of ideas regarding race, gender, sexuality, ideas about manners and civility, and so forth. So the domestic sphere is definitely one realm where that kind of provisioning and equipping with ideas happens. But also when we think about the work of social reproduction, equipping a current and future generation of people for their place in society, healthcare, social services, social work, and education, and including and maybe especially institutions of public education. And so, I think the other thing that's important to think about with social reproduction is that even though it's hidden, and Marx even in Capital, Volume 1 of Capital, emphasized a couple of times how the reproduction of labor power is absolutely, it's the hinge that on which all profit depends. And yet he mostly doesn't talk about how it happens. It's really a hidden abode. But if we understand that the source of all value and the operation of society and the status quo of things depends on the social reproduction of the ideas of society, and then the workers, and the people within it. Capitalism vitally depends on it, but it also regards it as a big hit to its profit. So it doesn't want to pay for it. And so that's where you get the working up of this vitally necessary social reproductive work as women's work, so it should be unwaged, or unskilled work, so it should be low wage, and so forth. So what this has to do, I think, with fighting austerity measures on campus is that if we understand that broadly the university is a prime site of social reproduction, and that austerity is about trying to cheapen the costs of social reproduction, then maybe, for starters, faculty in one department can recognize faculty in another department as experiencing the same kind of squeeze. And we might also recognize that the kind of squeeze we're feeling is also being felt by Sodexo workers. Those would be the food services workers on my campus, by students with the heavy debt loads that they're carrying. And we might also recognize that none of us individually or factionally have that much power, especially when fewer than 25% of the faculty today even have access to tenure. There are very few pockets of privilege that are left, but that collectively we could have power if we understand that we're all within this institution that is about social reproduction and that's trying to offload that work onto us for little or no pay or benefits.
Okay. In both Living Room and this new work, you're focused on the privatization of public subjectivities and public institutions. Living Room seems to be more focused on teaching students how to engage publicness as individuals through rhetorical action, while your new work calls for collective action. Can you describe the relationship between individual and collective action?
So I think of Living Room as having a kind of an arc from beginning to end. The early chapters, very much about raising consciousness about and interrogation into how experiences that get worked up as being personal or private, not narratable, not a source of argument or protest, how those are actually social and can be contested and examined as such. So it goes from there to the later chapters where there's the story of the League of Revolutionary Black Auto Workers in Detroit. There on my campus, the student actions for divestment from apartheid South Africa, and then more recently for livable wages. Those are much more about collective action. And I guess that as far as my thinking about the relationship goes, is that I tend to approach it through class terms. And that is, if we think of rhetorical means as a matter of class, I as an individual don't own or control the major means of production in this country, and I don't have I'm not in charge of the major means of disseminating ideas and deciding laws and policies and so forth. So I don't have ruling class rhetorical means. I may have middle class rhetorical means. I can go to a school board meeting and stand up and speak my piece, or write a letter to the editor if I still live in a town that has a newspaper. But those are kind of middling means and a middling amount of power. And it's in working class, mass, collective, solidarity, rhetorical action that more powerful means can be found. So that's why I've emphasized so much working class collective action, and that history that has been so suppressed in recent years. And I've been interested in that also because of how much that's been understudied or even denigrated in rhetoric. That because we're supposed to value the rhetoric of the open hand, not the closed fist. and so forth. But I will say, that said, I've also been thinking more recently about the roles of public intellectuals or organic intellectuals who certainly derive their voices and their visions from mass movements, but who also are able to use a kind of individual ethos and platform to project a set of ideas. So you think about Naomi Klein in the environmental justice movement, Arundhati Roy with global economic justice, Alice Walker and Roger Waters with justice for Palestine and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, Dave Zirin and the politics of sports. This isn't something I've done any work on or thought about too much, but recently, I have thought it would be interesting to look at and think more about the role of organic and public intellectualism in relation to mass movements.
Is that something where you think your work is going next, or can you describe what you imagine next on the horizon for you?
Well, I know that immediately next on my horizon is an edited collection that I'm working on with Susan Jarrett and Jonathan Alexander called Unruly Rhetorics. And particularly, so it'll be a collection of essays that each one of which will take a particular movement and moment in service to broader democratization, social justice, but really trying to do both kind of ethnographic, really understanding how that particular movement and its rhetorical means came together, historical, not just taking it as a kind of one moment flash, but understanding the kind of longer history and sponsorship that created it. And, I guess really trying to fill a gap within composition and rhetoric of not having a whole lot of work that's been done around protest rhetoric, body rhetoric, and so forth. And that's my next project, particularly because after working on composition in the age of austerity, I feel like I could get very depressed. Like this, just this defunding, privatizing, deforming onslaught that we're facing in public universities. And so going back to that history of unruliness that created our ideas of public higher education to begin with is bracing, to say the least. It makes me feel a lot better.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Welch, for joining us and answering our questions. And we look forward to seeing you in February.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to February too.